The ledger she left behind. My name is Marin Ellis, and I was 20 at my college graduation when my mother stood up at the family bakery and used the toast to tell 200 guests exactly what she thought of me. She lifted her glass and said, "Marin has always been the responsible one. Someone had to be, since she was never going to be the one people noticed." Then she turned to my younger sister, straightened the ribbon in her hair, and added, "Now Ivy. Ivy is the one who lights up a room. Some daughters you keep for show, and some you keep for spreadsheets." People laughed. Not everyone, but enough. My father busied himself refilling coffee cups. 3 cousins had their phones out before she even finished the sentence. I stood next to a banner with my name stitched across it in gold thread my grandmother had sewn, and I understood all at once that I had been cast as the punchline at my own celebration. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who love you on paper and felt completely invisible in front of them? I walked to the back office of the bakery that night, opened the metal cash box where I kept my catering tips, and counted $290. I left my apartment key, the one to the unit above the shop that my parents had let me use rent-free, on top of an unsigned graduation card. I did not wait for the cake to be cut. Within a month, nobody in my family brought up my name at dinner. They told the extended family I had gone through something. They never said what. Before I tell you what happened at my sister's wedding 14 years later, and the question her husband asked that unraveled everything my mother had spent a decade building, tell me where you are watching this from right now, and what time it is there. I like knowing how far a story like this one has traveled. The bus ticket out of Modesto cost $31, and it left me with $259, and no plan beyond putting distance between myself and a house where I had become a punchline. I picked Reno because a girl from my accounting class had once mentioned cheap rent near the university there. When I arrived, the rental office was closed for the weekend, and every motel near the station wanted more money than I had. I spent my first night in an all-night diner, nursing 1 cup of coffee for 6 hours and pretending to read a newspaper I had already finished twice. The next morning I found a paper sign taped to the window of a small bookkeeping firm, looking for a filing clerk. I told the woman at the desk I was good with numbers and detail work, which was true, though I left out that I had nowhere else to be that day. She hired me on the spot because the last person had quit without notice. That office became the first place in my life where nobody commented on how I looked, only on whether the columns balanced. I was good at it. I was quiet, careful, and I never let a decimal point drift. I rented a room from a woman named Dee Alvarez, a paralegal 10 years older than me who had buried a marriage and come out the other side sharper for it. Dee did not coddle me. She gave me 2 weeks to come up with rent and told me, on day 1, never to touch the leftover pad tie with her name written on it in permanent marker. Her bluntness was the first honest thing anyone had offered me in years, and I trusted it completely. On my 9th night in that apartment, my mother called the landline. Dee picked up because I was in the shower. I walked out just in time to hear my mother's voice saying, "Tell Marin that hiding does not make her any easier to be proud of." Dee put the call on speaker and asked, calm as anything, "Is this how you always talk to your kids, or am I catching you on a bad night?" My mother told her I was unstable and had a habit of exaggerating things, then hung up. I stood in that kitchen shaking, not because I believed a word of it, but because I finally heard, out loud, how effortlessly she could reshape me for an audience she had never even met. Dee opened a drawer, pulled out a notebook, and told me to write down the date, the number the call came from, and exactly what was said. She said people who lie that smoothly are counting on nobody keeping receipts. That sentence rearranged something in me. I started keeping a folder. Every voicemail, every card, every message. During the day, I studied for my accounting certification. At night, I worked reconciling ledgers for small businesses that could not afford a full-time bookkeeper, and I learned that numbers, unlike people, do not know how to lie convincingly for long. A number moved for a reason. Find the reason, and you found the truth underneath it. My family sent 2 letters that first year. One demanded I apologize for embarrassing them by leaving. The other said my father's blood pressure had gotten dangerous, which I later found out was not true. I did not answer either one, but leaving does not mean the wound closes behind you. For years, every time someone complimented my work, I heard an echo underneath it: some daughters you keep for show. I stopped going to work parties. I dressed like I was trying to disappear into a room rather than be remembered in one. Distance had freed my body, but my mother's voice had somehow packed itself into my luggage and followed me across state lines. Is not that the cruelest part of walking away? Discovering that you can leave the house, but the house does not always leave you. Dee was the one who pushed me to sit for the forensic accounting certification exam after a professor mentioned how quickly I spotted inconsistencies in a sample audit. I almost did not apply. The course fees were more money than I had ever had at once. Dee reminded me that every dollar I had was one I had earned without asking anyone's permission first. I applied. I got partial funding. I spent the next 3 years working days while studying fraud detection, forensic auditing, financial statement analysis, and courtroom evidence standards at night. My mother had taught me that a person's worth got decided by whoever was loudest in the room. That office taught me something else. A tidy set of books could be hiding a crime, and a messy one could be telling the whole truth if you were patient enough to read it. By 26, I had my certification and a junior position at a regional forensic accounting firm in Sacramento that specialized in embezzlement, insurance fraud, and small business misrepresentation. The work was slow and unglamorous. Long days spent tracing wire transfers, matching invoice numbers, and interviewing people who thought confidence could substitute for a paper trail. I loved every hour of it. Every case handed me something my childhood never had, which was a version of the truth that could not be talked over by whoever raised their voice first. Dee moved to Sacramento not long after I did, for a firm of her own, and she remained the first call I made whenever a case rattled me, or whenever a letter showed up from home. My father sent birthday cards with no return address. My sister Ivy would occasionally send a friend request online, then delete it before I could respond. My mother stayed publicly quiet, but relatives told me she had rewritten my leaving into a story where she was the wounded party, betrayed by an ungrateful, jealous daughter who could not stand watching her sister shine. I thought about posting the video from graduation more than once. I never did. Revenge built on someone else's humiliation would have made me exactly like her. Instead, I built a life she had no part in narrating. By 29, I was a senior forensic analyst, teaching fraud prevention seminars for small business owners, and consulting on 2 multi-state embezzlement cases. That was also the year I met Theo Navarro, a structural engineer who never rushed to fill a silence, which, after everything, felt like the safest thing a person had ever offered me. He did not tell me I was pretty on our first date. He told me I was formidable, after I calmly and correctly explained to a waiter why our bill had been calculated wrong twice. Somehow that landed harder than any compliment ever had. I told him about my family slowly, in pieces, and he never once pushed me toward reconciliation. He only asked whether the distance I kept gave me peace, or whether it was postponing a conversation I was not ready to have. Some days I still do not know the answer. Then, 11 years after I left, a routine fraud investigation landed a familiar signature on my desk. Our firm had been brought on to examine a small chain of bakeries in the Central Valley that had taken out an emergency business loan after claiming storm damage to 2 locations. Something about the supporting documents did not sit right with the underwriter. At first, the business name meant nothing, since my parents had rebranded years earlier under a holding company. Then I recognized the address on the loan application. It was the same bakery where my graduation toast had happened. I disclosed the conflict immediately and requested to be taken off the case. But before I handed the file over, I saw a guarantor authorization form carrying my full legal name, Maren Elise Ellis. The signature was close enough to fool a teller, but not close enough to fool someone who had spent a decade studying exactly how signatures behave under pressure. The form listed me as a co-guarantor with an ownership stake in the business. I had never owned a percentage of that bakery, and I had certainly never signed anything. The application was dated 4 years after I left home. My old social security number and a former address were attached to it. For a moment I was 20 again, standing under that banner while a room full of people laughed. My mother had spent years telling everyone I abandoned the family. Quietly, apparently, she had also decided my name still belonged to her whenever it was useful. Because of the conflict, I could not investigate the case myself, but nothing stopped me from pulling my own credit report and filing an identity theft claim. What I found went far beyond one guarantor form. 2 years after I left, someone had opened a supply line of credit in my name. It had been paid down carefully enough to avoid drawing attention, which had, over time, built a credit history solid enough to support the bakery's expansion loans. My name had been attached to equipment financing, a commercial lease guarantee, and most recently, a personal line of credit that had just been increased by $94,000. Theo sat with me at our kitchen table while I laid the documents out in order. "Are you going to call them?" he asked. I told him no, not yet. Confronting them now would only give my mother time to shred paperwork and build a new story before I had proof of the old one. I froze my credit, filed formal reports, hired an attorney licensed in California, and let the lender's fraud department take over the timing. For the first time in my life, I was not responding to my family as the difficult daughter. I was responding as an examiner protecting evidence. A few weeks later, Ivy called me. I had not heard her voice in 11 years. She cried, said our mother had been under enormous financial pressure, and asked me to sign a statement saying I had verbally agreed to all of it years ago. She called it a formality. When I said no, her tone shifted completely. "You already left us once," she said. "Are you really going to ruin Mom over a signature on a piece of paper?" I asked her whose idea it had originally been to use my name. She went quiet for a long moment before answering. "You were not using your credit for anything anyway." That sentence ended whatever soft feeling I had still been holding onto. My family had not simply forgotten about me after I left. They had treated my identity like a spare room they were entitled to move into whenever it suited them. Before hanging up, Ivy mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she was engaged to a man named Grant Whitfield, a commercial loan officer from Fresno. The wedding would be held that autumn at a restored vineyard estate, and our mother was, apparently, footing the entire bill. When I pulled the credit line again, several large payments had gone directly to an event planning company connected to that exact vineyard. The wedding was not being paid for out of pocket. It was being financed with debt secured under my stolen identity. I sent everything to my attorney and said nothing to anyone else. I would not need to invent a punishment. I only had to stop shielding them from consequences they had already put in motion. 3 months before the wedding, a cream-colored invitation arrived at my office. My name handwritten, no personal note attached. It described the day as a celebration of family and new beginnings. Dee thought they wanted me there to project a healed, reunited family before the fraud case went public. Theo thought it was more calculated than that. If I showed up and said nothing, my mother could later claim my presence proved I had known about and accepted the loans all along. My attorney agreed attending could actually work in my favor, as long as I made no statements about the ongoing investigation and kept copies of my report with me. I told Theo I would go alone. He offered to come. I told him I needed to walk into that building without anyone standing between me and my own family. I was not going back to prove that someone loved me. I was going back as the only person who still owned my name. On the morning of the wedding, I wore a navy dress and the watch Dee had given me the day I passed my certification exam. The vineyard estate sat less than 40 minutes from the house I grew up in, but it might as well have been another country. Stone paths, string lights, white tablecloths, a string trio warming up near the arbor. My mother spotted me at the guest book table and froze before recovering into her practiced hostess smile. "Marin," she said, loudly enough for the nearby cluster of relatives to hear. "Look who finally decided we were worth showing up for." A few people laughed nervously. 14 years earlier, that sound would have sent me straight to the parking lot. This time I held her eyes and said, "I remember exactly what kind of family this is." My father appeared behind her, thinner and grayer than I remembered, and hugged me before I could brace for it. He whispered that he was sorry. I stepped back and asked, "Sorry for what?" He glanced at my mother and said, "For how it all happened." That answer told me everything I needed to know. He still could not name what he had allowed. Ivy found me near the tent in her robe, surrounded by bridesmaids and a photographer, and pulled me into a stiff hug for the camera. "Let us not make today about old stuff," she whispered. "Then stop financing it with my name," I said back. Her grip tightened on my arm for exactly 1 second before she remembered the photographer was watching, and the bride mask slid back into place. My mother introduced me to guests as her responsible daughter, the one who needed her space. She told one couple I had left because I could not handle being outshined. She was midway through a story about my awkward teenage years when I interrupted and asked whether she had shown any of these guests the loan paperwork yet. Her face lost color. She steered me into a small side room off the reception tent and shut the door. My father followed. Ivy stayed in the doorway, pretending not to listen. My mother accused me of timing the investigation to sabotage the wedding on purpose. She insisted the paperwork was just family members helping manage the business, not fraud, since parents handle things for their kids all the time. I reminded her I had been a legal adult living 3 states away for over a decade. My father said the bakery chain had been on the verge of collapsing, and 11 employees depended on it staying open. "So you volunteered my identity to keep the lights on," I said. He admitted my mother had used my information first because my credit was clean, that he had objected, and then signed the corporate paperwork supporting it anyway. His confession sounded almost relieved, like admitting the smaller crime made the larger one easier to carry. My mother pulled a folded statement out of her handbag. It claimed I had given verbal consent to everything years ago and had only recently grown confused due to personal stress. She offered me $60,000 after the refinancing closed if I signed it right there. I recognized the formatting. It matched the lender's file exactly. "You invited me here to turn fraud into consent," I said. She told me to stop using dramatic legal language. Then she reached for my bag, trying to pull the folder with my reports out of it. I got there first. Ivy stepped fully into the room and locked the door behind her. "Just sign it," she said. "Mom already put down non-refundable deposits." I asked whether Grant knew where the wedding funding had actually come from. Ivy looked at the floor. That was the whole answer. I handed the statement back to my mother and told her every attempt to pressure me from that point forward would be documented. When I opened the door, Grant was standing in the hallway. He had only caught the last sentence, but it had already changed his expression. He asked if there was a financial problem affecting the wedding. Ivy quickly called it a private business misunderstanding. I said nothing, because my attorney had been clear that I could not interfere with the lender's own process. But Grant's eyes went to the folder in my hand and the unsigned statement still sitting on the table. As someone who reviewed loans for a living, he clearly recognized exactly what he was looking at. My mother laughed it off as wedding day nerves and pulled him away, but the suspicion had already taken root. The ceremony was 20 minutes out. For the first time, my mother was not afraid of losing me. She was afraid someone might finally believe me. I sat near the back of the tent while guests filled the rows beneath the arbor. Relatives kept glancing back at me like I was a story they had already half heard and disagreed on the ending of. An aunt leaned over and said my mother had forgiven me a long time ago. I asked what exactly there was to forgive, and she suddenly became very interested in her program. 10 minutes before the processional, Grant found me by the edge of the tent, phone in hand, and asked to speak privately. His voice was controlled, but I recognized the look of a man whose professional instincts had picked up a pattern his heart did not want to accept yet. We stepped into the vineyard's small tasting room. He explained that the estate's event coordinator had just told him the final payment had bounced back for review. The account funding the wedding had thrown a flag. Ivy had always told him the money came from the family business. The transaction notice, however, listed the guarantor as Marin A. Ellis. "Is that you?" he asked. I said yes. "Did you authorize it?" I said no. I told him I had reported the identity theft months before the invitation ever arrived, and that the timing after that had never been mine to control. I showed him my case number, a copy of the forged signature, and the statement my mother had tried to hand me less than an hour earlier. I did not reveal anything confidential about the active investigation. I did not exaggerate a single detail. The truth did not need help. Grant read the statement twice. "Does Ivy know?" he asked. I told him to ask her himself. My mother walked in before he could say anything else. She accused me of cornering the groom to destroy my sister's happiness. Grant held up the statement and asked why it had already been drafted before I even arrived that morning. She said their lawyer had prepared it to clear up a misunderstanding. He asked why Ivy had told him the wedding was paid for out-of-business profits when the funds actually traced back to a credit line guaranteed under my name. Ivy walked in wearing her dress, my father trailing behind her. Her first question was not whether I had been harmed. It was whether the ceremony could still go forward if the payment cleared by Monday. Grant looked at her like she had answered a completely different question than the one he asked. "You knew," he said. She admitted she knew our mother had borrowed money, just not that any of it involved forged documents. I reminded her of our phone call. My mother snapped that recording a family conversation was a betrayal in itself. "Stealing my social security number was the betrayal," I said. My father closed the door to the tasting room, but half the wedding party had already gathered outside it. Ivy started crying, insisting she deserved one single day untouched by my anger toward this family. She talked about what she had lived through since I left. Our mother's pressure, our father's silence, the business nearly failing twice, and the constant expectation that she be the daughter who made everything look easy. For the first time, I saw that she had been shaped by the exact same machine, just rewarded differently for surviving it. But being hurt does not erase the harm you cause, I told her. You could have told him. You could have told me. Instead, you let them build your wedding on top of the sister you claim abandoned you. My mother stepped between us and said family money belongs to family. She had raised me, fed me, and in her mind that made my credit history fair compensation. Grant asked whether she had used Ivy's identity too. Nobody answered right away. He turned to my father, who finally admitted one piece of equipment financing had been filed under Ivy's name, supposedly with her permission. Ivy immediately said she never agreed to that either. That contradiction cracked something open in the room. My mother had normalized this so completely that even her favorite daughter could not say where consent ended and manipulation began. The coordinator knocked and said guests were seated. My mother told everyone to get back into position. Grant said he needed a minute. She warned that any delay would humiliate the family in front of every client and vendor watching. Her concern was never the fraud or the people harmed by it. It was the audience. That was the moment I finally understood why she had humiliated me publicly at my own graduation all those years ago. Private cruelty only controls one person. Public cruelty controls a whole room. She had spent her entire life turning crowds into weapons. Now that same crowd was becoming a witness. Grant asked Ivy, one final time, whether she had known my name was on the wedding's financing. She admitted she had known for 3 months. She said our mother promised I would eventually sign a release. "So you were planning to marry me before telling me your sister disputed the money paying for our own wedding?" he asked. Ivy reached for his hand. He stepped back. The string trio started playing outside, unaware the whole wedding party had stopped moving. My mother grabbed my wrist and hissed that none of this would be happening if I had just stayed gone. I pulled my hand free. "No," I said. It is happening because you assumed I would stay quiet forever." Grant opened the door. The coordinator asked if the ceremony should begin. He looked out at the arbor, then back at Ivy. "Yes," he said, "just not the one she planned." Grant walked out to the arbor alone and asked the musicians to stop. Conversation died down as 200 guests turned to look at him. My mother rushed forward, calling it a private family matter. He told her it stopped being private the moment his name went onto vendor contracts tied to disputed funds. Then he turned toward Ivy, who had followed a few steps behind, still holding her bouquet, while my mother whispered instructions nobody was listening to anymore. I stayed near the tasting room entrance with my father. Part of me wanted to walk to my car and leave all of it behind. I had not come to watch my sister fall apart in front of 200 people, and I did not want to become someone who used public humiliation as a weapon, the way my mother had. But leaving now would only hand her room to write a new version of events before the guests reached the parking lot. Grant apologized to the crowd for the delay and said new information had come to light, both about the wedding's funding and about what he had been told throughout the engagement. My mother tried to grab the microphone, calling it a private disagreement. He told her it stopped being private the second his name was on the paperwork. Then he faced Ivy directly. His voice stayed level, but the silence in that tent carried it to the back row anyway. "Ivy," he said, "why is your estranged sister the guarantor on the loan that paid for this wedding? And why did you keep that from me after she reported her signature had been forged?" The question landed harder than any shout could have. Ivy's face went blank. The bouquet slipped an inch in her hand. Someone near the aisle whispered the word "forged" loud enough to travel 3 rows back. My mother lunged for the microphone. Grant moved it out of reach. Ivy said she trusted our mother and believed I would eventually sign off since the money was already spent. Grant asked if that meant she had knowingly accepted stolen funds and planned to secure forgiveness after the fact. She said families help each other. He looked over at me and asked whether she had reached out before taking the money at all. She admitted the only call had been to pressure me into signing. My mother accused Grant of humiliating his own bride in front of everyone. He said the deception created the humiliation, not the question exposing it. Then he told the crowd he would not be going through with the marriage. Ivy stumbled backward. The reaction moved through the tent in waves, gasps, whispers, phones lifting into the air, relatives already heading for the exits. The same people who had laughed at my graduation now watched the favored daughter's perfect wedding collapse under facts they could not wave away. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the particular stillness of watching a structure finally give out at its weakest point. My mother tried one last time to seize the narrative, announcing to the tent that I had manipulated Grant out of jealousy over Ivy's happiness. 14 years later, and it was still the only weapon she owned. This time, it did not land. I walked forward, but I did not take the microphone. I told Grant I had never asked him to call off the wedding. He confirmed the decision was entirely his. Then I turned to the guests and stated 3 plain facts. I never authorized those loans. I filed an identity theft report months before the invitation ever arrived, and my mother had tried to get me to sign a false statement less than an hour earlier that same day. I held up the unsigned document. My father stepped forward and admitted, out loud, to witnessing paperwork prepared without my knowledge. It did not clear him, but it kept my mother from being able to claim I had made any of it up. One of her business partners left immediately to call an attorney. A supplier asked whether his invoices had been used the same way mine had. The damage spread fast because the fraud had never been limited to just me. My name had simply been the thread someone pulled first. Lender representatives arrived that same afternoon. Once it became clear my mother had tried to obtain a false corrective statement while an active fraud review was underway. They did not arrest her in front of 200 guests, and I was relieved by that. I wanted accountability, not a spectacle. They collected the statement, requested access to the business's financial records, and instructed everyone involved not to alter anything. The vineyard froze the event account. Vendors started calling Ivy about unpaid balances within the hour. If you are still with me, this is usually where I would ask you to consider hitting subscribe here on Alex, because stories like Marin's are exactly why this channel exists, and there is more of her story left to tell. My sister sat alone in the bridal suite that evening while her friends packed away centerpieces and boxed up gifts nobody would keep. She asked me to come in. For a long stretch, neither of us said anything. Without an audience to perform for, she looked less like our mother's success story and more like a frightened woman who had built her whole identity around being the chosen one. She blamed me first, then Grant, then the lender, then our father, and finally, quietly, our mother. I let her run out of names. You knew my name was on that loan, I said. That is where you had a choice. She admitted she had been afraid the wedding would fall apart if she asked too many questions. I told her I understood fear. Fear does not turn theft into love, though. She asked if I was happy. The question told me she still thought my goal had been to trade places with her to become the chosen daughter while she became the disgraced one. No, I told her. I am free. Those are not the same thing. By that evening, the tent stood empty except for staff folding chairs under string lights nobody had bothered to turn off. My mother found me near the entrance and said I had gotten exactly what I wanted. The business under threat, my sister left standing alone, the whole family exposed in front of everyone she cared about impressing. I told her she still would not name what she had actually done. She forged documents, lied to a lender, and used her own daughter's wedding to pressure me into legalizing the theft. I had not destroyed her reputation. I had simply stopped lending her my silence to protect it. She called me cold, ungrateful, incapable of being loved the way Ivy was. The words landed old and small, the way old threats do once you have already survived worse than them. You taught me that love in this family had a price, and the price was disappearing, I said. I spent 14 years learning that real love does not come with an invoice. Then I walked out of that tent carrying the folder she had tried to take from me. I had not left home with $290 for nothing. I left this time with my name still fully mine. My mother eventually cooperated with the investigation, repaid a portion of the debt through the sale of 2 of the bakery locations, and, having no prior record, was sentenced to probation, financial monitoring, and a restitution order that consumed most of what she had spent decades building her image on top of. The remaining store closed its doors the following spring. She had always believed her reputation was something she got to control, deciding who stood in the light and who got left in the back office. She did not lose that control because I came back. She lost it because paperwork remembers exactly what people agree to and then quietly hope everyone else will forget. My father admitted, on record, to signing off on documents that supported the fraud. He avoided criminal charges by cooperating fully, but lost the business, most of his savings, and the trust of employees who had believed in him for 20 years. He started sending monthly letters, full of explanations about keeping the peace and believing my mother would eventually fix things on her own. I returned the first 2 unopened. In the third, he finally wrote, "I kept myself out of the conflict by letting you carry all of it instead." I wrote back once and told him forgiveness was not something he could request. It was something he would have to build, whether or not I was there to see it happen. Ivy spent months untangling vendor disputes and canceled contracts from a wedding that never happened. Grant ended the engagement for good. She eventually moved to Fresno, took a job at a community arts nonprofit, and started therapy. A little under 2 years after the wedding, she called me without asking for money, a signature, or forgiveness. She apologized for the part she played in erasing me, and admitted that being the favorite had never actually made her safe. It had just made her useful. Our mother had praised her charm right up until it stopped serving the family image, and then called her disloyal the moment she cooperated with the fraud investigation instead. I told Ivy an apology was a start, not proof. Since then, we have built something small and careful made of verifiable things instead of big gestures. She tells me the truth even when it makes her look bad, and I let the rest of it stay in the past where it belongs. We meet twice a year in public, with no dramatic reunions, no pretending 14 years never happened. There is only the slow, unglamorous work of finding out whether trust can grow somewhere entitlement used to live. Theo and I got married at the county courthouse with Dee and 4 friends present. Nobody ranked the women in the room by how they looked, and nobody used the ceremony to repair a reputation. When the clerk asked if I wanted to change my name, I said no. Marin Ellis had once been a name my mother placed on forged paperwork because she believed it still belonged to her. Keeping it was my way of proving that a name does not stop being yours just because someone else decides to misuse it. I run my own forensic accounting practice now, helping small businesses and family-run companies catch internal fraud before it becomes part of the culture. I also set up an emergency fund at the bookkeeping firm that gave me my first real job when I had almost nothing left. It offers $290 to anyone facing a sudden housing or transportation emergency. It is not a fortune, but I know exactly how far that amount can carry someone, paired with one honest opportunity. People sometimes ask if exposing my family was about revenge. I understand why they ask. A wedding stopped. A business closed. My mother lost the authority she had spent decades protecting. But revenge would have meant manufacturing their pain for the satisfaction of watching it happen. I did not create their consequences. I documented what they had already done, refused to sign away the truth, and let the people affected by their choices decide what to do with that information. Boundaries are not punishment. They are simply the conditions for access to your life. Accountability does not become cruelty just because the person facing it happens to share your last name. Love without honesty is just control wearing a nicer outfit. For a long time, I believed leaving made me the daughter who broke this family apart. What the investigation taught me is that I had only stopped being the one holding its cracks together. My mother's biggest loss was not the bakery. It was losing the ability to decide what was true for everyone around her. My sister's biggest loss was not the wedding. It was learning that being chosen by someone controlling can still be its own kind of captivity. My father's biggest loss was realizing that staying quiet is still a decision, even when someone else is the one paying for it. My win was never proving I had been right all along. It was walking away without needing anyone's permission to already know who I was. 14 years ago, my mother stood up in front of a room and said I was the daughter you keep for spreadsheets, not the one you keep for show. She thought those words would keep me chasing her approval for the rest of my life. Instead, they pushed me somewhere she could never reach again. I left with $290, no home waiting for me, and no promise that any of it would work out. What I found instead turned out to matter more. Independence, real friendship, a career built on facts nobody could talk over, and the ability to spot manipulation long before I ever mistook it for love. You do not have to burn down the people who hurt you in order to take your life back. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply stop covering for them, stop funding their comfort with your own dignity, and stop treating your presence in their life as something owed rather than something chosen. A relationship that only survives because you stay quiet is not peace. It is just captivity with better lighting. So ask yourself this. If keeping your family's image intact requires you to keep disappearing, whose family are you really protecting? And what might your life look like the day you finally decide to protect yourself instead? Thank you for staying until the end of Marin's story. Everything you just heard is a work of fiction, written for storytelling and reflection only. We hope it is a reminder that you can be generous, loyal, and forgiving without ever letting those qualities be mistaken for an invitation to hurt you. The people who deserve your softness will treasure it. They will never use it against you.